Annamaria Hemingway, and I am the author of Myths of the Afterlife Made Easy. And Myths of the Afterlife are probably one of the topics that has been written about mostly in all cultures since the evolution of human consciousness. We all have myths of an afterlife. Whatever religious or spiritual tradition we come from, we have a view of at the end of physical life, consciousness actually carrying on in some form. And as human beings, we're fascinated by the topic. Probably because it's the one thing that we have hope and faith in, to a certain extent, but nobody's actually come back to tell us what it's really like. So our myths, and I like to qualify the word myth here. Myth, in the context that I'm writing about it, is not a made-up series of wishes or hopes or desires. It's actually well-documented stories from cultures that perhaps lived thousands of years before our own. One of the most famous cultures that wrote about an afterlife is the Egyptians. And they were followed by many other cultural traditions that came through generations, and we read about them in all our own sacred texts, whether we're reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, a Christian Bible. We read about myths of the afterlife, or in that context, stories. Our mythology is what we believe in, what is passed down often in an oral tradition. And within the concept of all these myths are archetypes and symbols. And I don't know how familiar people are with archetypes and symbols, but archetypes and symbols are the energy that creates our myths. So whatever symbology is alive for you, which again could come from many different religious traditions, is what actually brings that myth alive to most people. And the nearest that we get to an afterlife journey that very much parallels ancient, certainly Egyptian writings and sacred texts, for want of a better word, is what we have now in the near-death journey. A near-death experience is an actual physical manifestation of consciousness when the body of that particular person is deemed to be clinically dead, and they actually have an after or otherworldly journey. These journeys are all very similar, and this book actually ties in the near-death experience and what are called deathbed visions, when a person close to dying actually has visions of an afterlife, or glimpses of religious imagery, or perhaps even people that have died before them. They don't come back to tell their story, because obviously they are in transition and at the end of their life, whereas those from a near-death experience do. And what is most interesting for us is to realise that the near-death experience, which generates an awful lot of curiosity and fascination, is not a new idea. They've occurred for thousands of years. Probably the Egyptians actually knew of the near-death journey before they even wrote some of their texts. And so what I've tried to do is do a kind of like quick voyage through various myths of the afterlife, tie them into what we have manifesting now as the near-death experience, so people can get an idea of where our mythologies come from. You know, what's perhaps most important is that we see in all these religious texts, we see in the near-death experience an affirmation. And the affirmation is a primordial affirmation of death and rebirth. So we have it in our natural world, we have it in our religious scriptures and texts, and we have it manifesting physically for some people in the near-death experience or in a deathbed vision. And tying all these things together actually makes us realise that you know, this mythology is still very much alive. It's very much in our consciousness, and it's probably occurring to several million people every year. I think in the last question or research, over 8 million people in America had a near-death experience, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. So these stories are all so remarkably similar, although each uniquely differs, that we see a pattern, and that pattern contains that archetypal energy that is and makes up our myths of the afterlife. So if anybody is interested in reading more about that, this is the book. Goodbye.